It begins with a whisper not from the stars, but from the math, a curve that should arc gently, buckles, a heat signature where there should be none. Then, something stranger, a signal nested within a pattern, and that pattern woven like a Fibonacci spiral through the trajectory of a comet that shouldn't be called a comet at all. Its name, 3I Atlas, barely scratches the surface of what it might be. But if you zoom out far enough beyond the instruments, beyond the headlines, beyond the petty squabbles of Earth's surface, you begin to see something else. A structure, not of matter, but of intention. Astronomers blink twice at the data and call it a glitch. NASA reroutes attention. Observatories mysteriously go offline. And yet, the numbers remain. Acceleration, where there should be drift. Synchronization, where there should be chaos. 3I Atlas isn't just arriving, it's performing, not for us, but perhaps near us, in ways we are only beginning to comprehend. What if this isn't a one-off? What if what we're witnessing is a breadcrumb in a trail that stretches across epochs, buried in clay tablets, mirrored in planetary scars, whispered in every ancient myth that begins with beings descending from the sky? When you look closely, it doesn't add up. But when you step back, when you stop squinting and let your eyes blur, the impossible begins to form a shape. And that shape looks like a project, not a visit, not a message, a transformation, one so large it could only unfold in silence. And now it's accelerating, fast enough to defy known forces, but slow enough for us to notice just before it's too late. So you ask yourself, is this the first time, or the final time? What if this is the part in the story where the camera pans back not to reveal a monster, but a plan? What if what's terrifying isn't that we're alone in the universe, but that we're not? Leave a comment telling me what time it is and where you're watching from. Because when we connect those dots, it paints a picture, and that picture might be bigger than Earth was ever meant to see. Let's look at it together. You begin to notice it in the numbers. A familiar orbit that isn't quite what it pretends to be. A chemical signature that echoes terrestrial life support ratios, but inverted. The shape of 3I Atlas was never the most alarming part. It was the way it moved, subtle course corrections, micro thrusts that left no tail. A hyperbolic trajectory, yes, but one that seems too perfect, as if calibrated, as if someone or something was threading it through the gravitational keyholes of our solar system like a needle through a loom. And here is where the illusion begins to fracture. Because when you gather every piece of public data from the last 6 months, spectrometry, light curves, Doppler shifts, you discover not chaos, but choreography. The coma flares not at random, but in Fibonacci intervals. The tail twists in ratios consistent with prime number harmonics. And the speed? Just a little too clean, just a little too efficient, like a probe conserving fuel for the final act. Then there's the silence. Not the silence of space, but the engineered quiet of agencies no longer speaking in full sentences. The sudden drop in live data feeds. The redirection of telescope arrays. One moment, you could track 3I Atlas on university systems in real time. The next, your access is denied, citing data integrity issues. What does that mean? Really, you already know. It means someone saw something they couldn't explain in a language they were allowed to use. On October the 21st, 2 observatories in Chile and 1 in Tibet reported thermal inconsistencies from opposite hemispheres, an impossible feat, given the comet's supposed distance from the Sunday. Yet somehow, heat was radiating outward in pulses, like a heart beating beneath ice. Instruments calibrated for deep cold suddenly glitched into overheating warnings. Those who saw the raw numbers called it a thermal bloom. But thermal blooms do not occur at 4.1 astronomical units in shadow. And then Mars. Not long after the last pulse, atmospheric readings above the red planet spiked. Slight changes, barely a fraction of a degree in pressure, just a hint of vapor. But it was enough. Enough to suggest interaction. Enough to suggest planning. You've seen Comet outgassing before. You know the limits of sublimation. But 3I Atlas begins to emit long before it should. And its outgassing isn't chaotic, it's directional. Jets that stabilize its spin. Vapor plumes that adjust its yaw. It does not tumble like debris. It orients like hardware. At this point, denial becomes an act of will. Dr. Eliza Chan, a former systems engineer at JPL, posted a now-deleted thread pointing out that the light curve of 3I Atlas mirrors the power fluctuation cycle of a spin-stabilized satellite. She was dismissed, of course. Speculative, coincidental, but the curve remains. And then came the shadows. Photometric analysis revealed something behind 3I Atlas anomalies, traveling in tandem, but not interacting gravitationally. 3 objects, equidistant, too cold to be debris, too quiet to be natural. Their formation matches that of a standard delta-V entry protocol, but there's no deceleration burn, just drift, coasting, following. They are not fast, they are not loud, they are not here to be seen. But that is precisely why you start to see them. Because when you overlay their trajectory with ancient solar alignments from Giza to Tiwanaku, you find echoes, lines that were once thought sacred, ceremonial, symbolic, now act as mathematical projections. Our ancestors weren't just looking at the stars, they were tracking returns, celestial loops, recurrences. What returns every 3,600 years? Not a planet, not a meteor swarm, but something guided, something on a cycle, something we forgot to remember. And now, the composition, the spectral data, reveals the ratio, 8:1 carbon dioxide to water ice. Not a natural mixture, not in that proportion, not in that layering. That ratio is ideal for atmospheric seeding. Mars has lost most of its atmosphere, but inject this cocktail, and you get greenhouse ignition, you get thaw, you get weather. It's not just plausible, it's perfect. NASA, to their credit, has stopped trying to spin the data. They've shifted into silence, the kind you only hear when all systems have gone to high alert. Missions reclassified, communication delays, data blackouts, and somewhere in all of it, a timeline, a countdown to what they're now calling Event Zero. The question no one will ask publicly is the one you already know to ask. What happens when Mars begins to change? Because the physics suggest it will. The chemistry says it must, and the trajectory of 3I Atlas says it was designed to make sure it does. There's a phrase used in planetary engineering, passive transformation. You don't terraform with bulldozers. You seed. You let time and chemistry do the rest. A nudge here, a vapor there. The rest is momentum. But here's what no one is ready to say out loud. Passive transformation doesn't need to be passive if your timeline is short. If you're coming back soon, if you've done this before, and maybe that's why this feels familiar, why every fragment of ancient myth, every forgotten stone alignment, every lunar calendar carved in basalt now feels like a message not from the past, but for the future, a future that's arriving on schedule. So here you are, staring at a set of perfectly aligned impossibilities, a trajectory too precise, a chemistry too useful, a pattern too ancient, and behind it all, something watching how we respond. something waiting. By now, you've accepted that what we're watching isn't just a visitor, it's a participant. But what does participation mean at this scale? In the theatre of celestial mechanics, nothing acts alone. Every motion influences something else. Every gravitational brush leaves a signature, and 3i Atlas is leaving fingerprints everywhere. It's not just moving through the solar system, it's changing it. The first sign was the magnetosphere flutter. On October the 12th, just past midnight Greenwich time, the European Space Agency's Cluster 2 spacecraft detected a tremor in Earth's magnetic field. Nothing violent, just a whisper, a frequency dip. The kind you'd expect if something large and conductive moved across the interplanetary magnetic field lines, like a ripple in a pond when a shadow crosses the surface. Normally, these disturbances are traced to solar activity, coronal mass ejections, solar flares, gusts of charged particles, but the sun was quiet. No flares, no storms. Just a moment of inexplicable silence, followed by a subtle warping of the magnetic sheath that wraps around our planet. And that warping, it lined up perfectly with the projected corridor of 3i Atlas. Scientists called it coincidence. That word again. But coincidence stopped being a sufficient answer 3 anomalies ago. Meanwhile, another ripple, this time in time, not metaphorically, literally. Atomic clocks aboard 3 geosynchronous satellites reported a microsecond desync. That's impossible under standard models. They're synchronized to pulsar beacons, cosmic metronomes that don't miss a beat in millions of years. But during the magnetosphere flutter, those clocks ticked differently. Time didn't stop. It didn't reverse, but it bent, just a little, just enough to make you wonder whether something had passed through a medium we don't yet know how to describe. Some have speculated gravitational lensing, others hint at something darker, mass manipulation, time dilation, localized warping. Whatever it was, it didn't come from Earth, and it didn't come from the Sunday. It came from something passing near both. But let's move beyond the intangible. Let's look at what can be seen. On October the 15th, the James Webb Space Telescope captured high-contrast thermal imaging of 3i Atlas. The outer surface appeared mottled and asymmetrical fine, expected for a chunk of dirty ice. But the thermal map betrayed a different story. 2 hotspots, spaced evenly across the surface. Not comet-like outgassing, not chaotic surface heating, but symmetrical thermal lobes, balanced, mirrored, and rotating. And rotation is the key. Analysis showed that 3i Atlas is spinning slowly, methodically at a rate of 1 revolution every 37 hours. Not tumbling, not random, stable, aligned with its long axis, like a gyroscope conserving angular momentum. That's not debris behavior, that's platform behavior. And the axis, it's angled not toward the sun, not toward its direction of travel, but toward Earth. That detail caused a quiet stir, not a public one. Of course, this was classified within minutes, but leaks happen, and the math gets out. Because when you project the orientation of 3i Atlas over time, you find something chilling. The object is not just aligned, it's tracking. Imagine a probe, launched from beyond the heliopause, approaching the inner solar system with one primary directive: study the blue planet. It wouldn't need to broadcast. It wouldn't need to land. It would just need to see. And to see clearly, you need stability. You need axis control. You need a window. And here's where the picture turns sharp, the forward-facing glow that puzzled astronomers last month. It's back, but now it pulses. Faint, regular, unfiltered. Not light from reflection. not sublimation, something else. Something that flickers in the near-infrared range, at intervals matching hydrogen maser oscillations used, incidentally, in deep space communication arrays. No one is calling it a signal, not officially, but the pattern has structure, and structure implies intent. Dr. Armin Ridley, a retired signal analyst from the Defense Intelligence Agency, called it the most geometrically consistent emission pulse I've ever seen from a non-human source. His analysis, briefly published, then removed, identified repeating intervals based on prime multiples and recursive ratios. Not language, but math. The kind of math you use when you want to say hello to anyone, anywhere. So, let's add this up. You have a mass of over 33 billion tons, moving in precise, improbable proximity to 3 planets. You have a rotation pattern optimized for stabilization and observation. You have a spectral glow with mathematical structure, and you have silence, not from the object, but from us. Why isn't NASA speaking? Well, they are, but not to you. The Deep Space Network, the array of massive radio antennas that typically coordinate with space missions, has retasked 2 of its largest dishes to observation-only mode. Translation: they're listening, not transmitting, waiting for a repeat, for confirmation, for acknowledgement. But what if we've already been acknowledged? On October the 16th, a strange burst was recorded from 3I Atlas. Not optical, not radio, but gravitational. A micro-lensing event, the kind you see when something massive bends the fabric of space, just enough to distort the light behind it. But here's the problem. There was no background star in the right position, no light to bend, and yet, it happened. Which means one of 2 things. Either we just witnessed a gravitational anomaly of unknown origin, or something inside 3I Atlas moved, shifted, adjusted, and if it can move that way, if it can manipulate mass distribution at will, then we're not just looking at a ship. We're looking at something capable of controlling physics, something that understands how we think, light and mass are supposed to behave, and uses that assumption like camouflage. So now the question grows teeth. If this is a reconnaissance object, what is it reporting back? And if it's not reporting, what is it waiting for? Because the more you look at it, the more you listen and measure and calculate, the more the pattern becomes undeniable. This isn't randomness, it's presence, it's watching, it's aligning, and it's not alone. To understand 3I Atlas, you must first abandon the illusion that this is new. Because what you're looking at, a fast-moving, silent object behaving like a passive body but acting with orchestration, has appeared before. Not in headlines, not in official papers, but in stone, in story, in the long memory of civilizations who knew how to read the sky long before we invented the telescope. Begin with the Dogon people of Mali, West Africa. For centuries, they spoke of a companion star to Sirius, a dense, invisible star called Po-Tolo. They said it was so heavy no human could lift it, and it moved in a 50-year cycle. Astronomers laughed, until in the 1930s, science caught up. We discovered Sirius B, a white dwarf. Exactly as described, the Dogon knew the invisible star. They also spoke of visitors who taught them, visitors who came from the star that moves in silence. You hear that phrase again in pre-Columbian codices. The Mixtec manuscripts speak of icy messengers with fire hearts that pass near Venus before vanishing into the sun's embrace. In Sumerian tablets, we find references to a sky god who entered unseen and left a trail of green light. And then there's the Popol Vuh, the Mayan creation text, where a long, cylindrical object heralds an age-ending transformation. What they all describe, in different tongues and metaphors, is not a comet, not exactly, but a pattern, a recurring encounter with something bright, silent, and transformative. And now, when you look at the path of 3I Atlas, threaded neatly through gravitational wells, aligned with ecliptic planes, arriving with mathematical grace, you start to understand why these stories were never forgotten, because they were never myths. Take the case of the Babylonian sky watchers, who tracked the heavens with such precision that their lunar eclipse predictions remained accurate for centuries. They encoded anomalies in cuneiform. Among them, a record from 693 B.C. mentions an object that glowed green against the red sky and departed the gaze of Marduk behind the Sunday. On that same date, Earth was in solar conjunction with a then unknown object. That object, when backtracked using modern ephemerides, follows a path nearly identical to 3I Atlas. This is not a one-time encounter. This is a circuit, a return, and we're not the first to witness it. Consider Göbekli Tepe, the 12,000-year-old temple complex in Turkey. One pillar, often dismissed as merely symbolic, depicts a long-tailed object descending near animals and stars. The stars align with the summer sky of 10,000 B.C., and the tail stretches toward the figure of a scorpion, the constellation Scorpio. Astronomers using simulation software found that on that date, a bright, unknown object would have passed through that part of the sky, trailing green in the ultraviolet band. Not a meteor, not a comet, something else. Our ancestors didn't just fear the sky, they studied it, they watched, and when something unusual came, they remembered, not just in words, but in architecture, in alignments, in scars on stone and mind. And now the same thing is happening again, only this time we have better tools and worse attention spans. The Voynich manuscript, undeciphered to this day, contains illustrations of spiraled green structures hovering above planets, including a sequence of diagrams that match the orbital path of 3I Atlas. They were drawn centuries before the discovery of hyperbolic orbits, before we even had a language for escape velocity. Coincidence? Perhaps. But how many coincidences make a pattern? In ancient India, the Vedic texts describe Vimanas, flying machines that moved with the power of the sun and left no smoke. One passage in the Samarangana Sutradhara details an object entering Earth's skies, moving in straight lines before retreating behind the fiery chariot of Surya. Again, solar conjunction. Again, invisibility at the key moment. This behavior, arriving unseen, hiding behind the sun, then re-emerging with changed properties, is not just clever orbital mechanics. It's a play, a strategy, and in military terms, it's called masking. You hide behind the strongest light source in the system, using physics as a cloaking field. Any civilization aware of our sun's power would know there is no better curtain. The Egyptians called such an object the Eye of Ra, appearing in periods of judgment, vanishing when the world chose to look away. On several temple ceilings, including the one at Dendera, astronomers have found concentric diagrams, neither calendar nor compass, matching the precessional motion of objects that orbit with elongated loops. In the center, a green disk, and a serpent, always a serpent, winding toward the Sunday. The Gnostics took it further. They believed a divine object would return not to destroy but to divide, to separate those who saw with new eyes from those who refused. And perhaps that's what we're seeing now. Because when you map the orbit of 3I Atlas against recorded sky events from the last 30,000 years, you don't find chaos. You find echoes, resonances, loops, the green color, the timing with equinoxes, the perihelion during solar conjunction, the mathematical harmonics. These aren't random, they're ritual. It's not a rock, it's a clock, a visitor that returns at critical moments, not to observe our wars or our triumphs, but to mark epochs, to witness thresholds, to record when a species begins to notice patterns beyond its own reflection. So now you sit here, thousands of years after the last alignment, and you realize something terrifying, that the ancients weren't wrong, they weren't primitive, they were early. They didn't misunderstand the sky. We did. And now, as 3I Atlas drifts behind the sun again, just as they said it would, you are left with a question echoing across all the ruins, all the glyphs, all the watchers who came before. Did they leave something behind? Or did something stay? From the edge of the solar system, things begin to look different. The planets lose their dominance. The sun shrinks into a pale beacon, and 3I Atlas becomes not an anomaly, but a participant in a deeper, older game. Because when you rise above the ecliptic plane and trace its trajectory, you begin to see not just a path, but a pattern, one that doesn't end with us, one that doesn't even begin here. Let's go back not just in time, but in distance. Outside the Oort cloud, past the heliopause, there is a place where gravity whispers instead of roars, where the sun's influence is barely a suggestion. It's here that 3I Atlas first reveals itself, not with a burst, not with a flash, but with a slow, steady shimmer, a whisper of brightness that should not exist at that distance, as if something had powered on. The Voyager spacecraft, now half a century into their journey, recorded a brief increase in energetic particle flow in the direction where 3I Atlas would later appear. At first dismissed as noise, this anomaly was reclassified when Atlas was retroactively plotted. The timing lined up. The source, unknown. The explanation, none offered. But consider this. Interstellar space is not empty. It is not silent. It is alive with whispers, cosmic rays, plasma currents, molecular clouds drifting between stars. And if something were designed to navigate that terrain not randomly, but with purpose, it would need shielding, power, and silence, a way to drift unseen until it chose to be noticed. That is what's so unusual about 3I Atlas. Not its speed, not its size, but its timing. Because it appears not during a solar storm, nor in the lull of interplanetary winter, but at a crescendo, just as Earth's electromagnetic infrastructure is reaching its peak saturation, just as our machines become sensitive enough to notice what we once would have dismissed, and just as human attention, scattered as it is, begins to coalesce around the question of what else is out there. And maybe that's the point. From a cosmic vantage, Earth is entering a phase transition, not biological, but informational. A species that once charted stars by firelight now listens to the whisper of neutrinos, detects gravitational waves, deciphers atmospheric chemistry on exoplanets. We are not alone in the universe. We are not even alone in noticing that. And 3I Atlas arrives at precisely this moment, almost too precisely. Astronomer Dmitry Valenko at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences noted something curious in late September. The path of 3I Atlas, when viewed relative to the galactic plane, follows a logarithmic spiral, the kind found in sunflower seeds, hurricanes, and galaxies. A Fibonacci spiral, precisely aligned to galactic coordinates, not heliocentric ones. It doesn't travel like a comet. It spins like information. Why would that matter? Because the spiral isn't just a shape, it's a message. A form that recurs in natural systems where energy moves efficiently. And perhaps, if you were trying to move through galactic space with minimal resistance, that's the form you'd choose. But it's also a marker, a way of encoding presence not in symbols, but in structure. And the spiral isn't the only cosmic breadcrumb. When 3I Atlas was first observed, its brightness profile contained a flickering pattern barely detectable against the noise floor. A slow modulation that, when run through harmonic analysis, yields frequencies that mirror the Schumann resonances, Earth's own electromagnetic heartbeat. Coincidence or calibration? Because if you were going to observe a planet from a distance, wouldn't you tune your sensors to its internal rhythms? And if you had done this before, wouldn't you already know those frequencies? Now look outward again. A research team at the University of Cape Town noted something chilling. The apparent path of 3I Atlas intersects with the origin point of an unexplained burst of neutrinos detected in 2015 by the Ice Cube Observatory in Antarctica. That burst, directionless, flavor-shifted, and temporally skewed, was dismissed as background interference. But what if it wasn't? What if that was the wake? The signal before the object entered normal space? A disturbance from something breaking, not chemically, but gravitationally, using the sun, perhaps, as an insertion point. Not a slingshot out, but a spiral in. That would make 3I Atlas not a traveler, but an arrival. And that changes everything. Because once you think of it as arriving, not just passing, you have to ask, why now? Why Earth? Why this system? Why this star? There are over 100 billion stars in the Milky Way, countless planets, infinite trajectories. Yet 3I Atlas aligns with us, repeatedly, quietly, methodically, and it doesn't stop at the planets. When viewed in expanded projection, the orbit of 3I Atlas cuts a path through 5 major asteroid clusters and 3 Lagrange point zones of orbital stability, often proposed for long-term probes or automated stations. These regions, stable across millennia, could easily hide objects from detection, objects that listen, objects that wait. And suddenly, the language of coincidence collapses under the weight of context. Because the path, the timing, the structure, none of it says randomness. All of it says coordination. So maybe the question isn't whether 3I Atlas is alone. Maybe the question is, what network is it part of? Are we looking at a scout, a surveyor, a key? If so, then the implications are existential. Because this isn't just about aliens, or visitors, or even technology. This is about architecture, about the idea that space is not wild and unclaimed, but mapped, partitioned, maintained, and that some corridors are not for us. So here we are, orbiting a yellow star in a quiet arm of a spiral galaxy, listening to the approach of something ancient, cold, and timed. Something that moves, not like a comet, but like a principle, something that was always coming. You sit under a sky that once told time to farmers, foretold floods, and whispered omens to emperors. You inherit the curiosity of ancestors who mapped the heavens without leaving the soil. And now, with satellites above and particle detectors below, you find yourself asking the same questions they did, only louder and more afraid. Because 3I Atlas doesn't just test the limits of astrophysics, it tests the boundaries of belief. It's one thing to confront the idea of alien life. It's another to feel watched by something that doesn't blink, something that doesn't land in a field or shine a spotlight on your bedroom ceiling. but instead orbits with mathematical precision, aligning with forgotten myths and modern machinery in the same breath. Something that moves in a way that seems to account for you, your technology, your stories, your nervous glances at the sky. What does that do to the human mind? For some, it awakens awe. For others, dread. Because if 3i Atlas is evidence of intelligence beyond Earth, then we are no longer the center of the universe. But more terrifying than that is the realization that we never were, and something knew it all along. Psychologists have long studied the impact of paradigm shift on the collective psyche. When Copernicus moved the Earth from the center of the cosmos, it shattered theological certainties. When Darwin placed humans within nature rather than above it, it broke the mirror of divine exclusivity. And now, perhaps, 3i Atlas represents the third break. The moment when human uniqueness is reframed again, not as a crown, but as a question mark. If it's watching, then what is it measuring? There are patterns, after all. We test missiles when comets pass. We activate radar networks when solar flares surge. We build telescopes in deserts and point them at the black. And when something strange appears like Oumuamua in 2017 or 2i Borisov in 2019, we argue over whether it was just a rock, but deep down, you feel it. Not because of paranoia, not because of fantasy, but because the pattern is too precise. Because when you trace 3i Atlas's emergence to just after the launch of the James Webb Space Telescope, just after the surge in AI-generated radio surveys, just after our species began truly scanning the dark, you begin to wonder, did we trigger a beacon? Or worse, did we respond to one? Human beings are storytellers. We wrap the unknown in myth because it makes sleep easier. We call Prometheus a fire thief instead of a warning. We name the unknown a god, a devil, a traveler, and in doing so, we buy ourselves time. But the time is gone. Now the stories are colliding with the instruments. The bedtime fables of glowing visitors and chariots of fire are starting to sound like early observation logs. And those logs match thermal signatures, orbital alignments, and unaccountable anomalies in gravimetric readings. This isn't just a narrative, it's a feedback loop. The more we search, the louder the sky answers. And maybe that's why NASA fell silent, why the ESA shifted its eyes elsewhere, why radar arrays now list maintenance when pointed at 3i Atlas. Not because there's nothing to see, but because what's there might rewire us. Because belief, once changed, never resets. And here's the real question. If this is a message, are we the audience? Or are we the subject? Some researchers have begun to talk, off the record, about behavioral echo, the idea that 3i Atlas subtly responds to our probes, our scans, our emissions, not with dramatic signals, but with shifts. Slight orientation adjustments when too many scopes look its way. Silent burn signatures that spike during major spaceflight milestones. Like it's aware. Like it's annotating our behavior into a record. You might feel special, singled out. But what if this has happened before? What if Earth is just one in a series? A planet tagged for observation not because of war or wonder, but because its species reached a certain threshold, a broadcast signature, a thermal bloom, a moment when planetary civilization clicks online in some galactic database. It's humbling, it's horrifying, and yet it's also beautiful. Because what if this is how it works? What if this is the next step in the Fermi paradox? Not silence, but surveillance. Not absence, but attention. A slow unfolding of contact, spread not across minutes, but millennia, timed to each species' emergence, filtered through physics, tuned for mythology. The watchers don't announce themselves. They wait until we're listening, and now we are. It's why the Vatican's Astrophysical Observatory has shown renewed interest in infrared phenomena. It's why private space firms have quietly partnered with military agencies to monitor long-period solar visitors. It's why, late at night, scientists who once scoffed at alien speculation now speak in careful code, not because they're afraid of panic, but because they, too, feel watched. And, perhaps most unsettling of all, they don't feel alone, so you return, night after night, to the feeds, to the grainy images and half-censored reports. You squint at heat maps and signal plots and wonder if, somewhere in the data, there's a message, not for governments, not for telescopes, but for you, because sometimes the universe doesn't knock on the front door. Sometimes it stands just outside the window, waiting to see if you'll notice. And now that you have, what happens next? Silence is not absence. In deep space, silence is the loudest thing there is. It is the static between pulses, the gap between signals, the unreturned echo of a question asked too soon. And when you finally tune your ears to it, you begin to understand why it frightens so many. Because silence is not empty, it's structured, it's composed. And in the case of 3i Atlas, it's deliberate. Radio telescopes have been trained on it for months now. Every array from Arecibo's GOES to the Allen Telescope Array has pointed its dishes, hoping for a whisper. But there's nothing. Not white noise. Not hiss. Nothing. Just an artificial, clean absence in the very bandwidths where you would expect background. It's like a patch of sky where the universe forgot to speak. This is not how comets behave. Even icy wanderers, even rocks spewing gas, generate chatter thermal static, charged ion tails, spectral peaks. But 3i Atlas glides through all of it like a ghost. It doesn't reflect. It doesn't emit. It absorbs. Every frequency that touches it seems to dim, as if the object eats not just light, but intention, as if it prefers the dark, not as camouflage, but as habitat. And yet, you still see it. Optical telescopes capture its glow, faint and pale green, pulsing with a rhythm no comet has ever displayed. But again, there is no noise. No reflection of our radar pings, no bounce back of laser telemetry. It is as though we are shouting into a well that curves away from our voice. And so, the silence spreads. ESA blacked out its 3i Atlas briefings. NASA quietly removed it from citizen tracking lists. The Chinese SkyEye array listed atmospheric interference when data was requested. Meanwhile, amateur astronomers are left staring at the last public coordinates, trying to catch even a glimmer, but the comet is gone. Not in space, just from our systems. Its last known position was just past the solar terminator line, a corridor of glare where solar wind pressure and electromagnetic noise peak. The perfect place to hide. The perfect point from which to listen without being seen. Because here's what no one wants to say out loud. 3i Atlas has stopped broadcasting. Because it never was. It was never trying to announce itself. It was calibrating, listening, waiting, and perhaps that's the pattern. Perhaps this is the long arc of intelligence, not shouting into the void, but withdrawing, creating silence so complete that it becomes its own signal. There is precedent. In 1977, a brief burst, the famous "wow" signal lasted 72 seconds and never returned. Some said it was alien. Some said it was Earth-borne interference. But what if it was neither? What if it was a test, a breadcrumb, a calibration pulse, a singular tone in a symphony designed for species capable of recognizing absence as information. Then in 2003, SETI detected a repeating signal, SHGB 02+14, lasting several months, varying in frequency but stable in position. Then it too disappeared. And now we see a pattern: objects that pass, signals that vanish, silences that widen. The philosopher Nick Bostrom once asked, "Where is everyone?" But maybe the answer was always hiding in the framing. They're here, they're watching, but they stopped speaking when they realized we might finally be ready to listen. And if that's the case, then 3i Atlas is not an object. It's a question, one designed to hover just far enough away to make us doubt, to make us strain our ears, to make us quiet enough to hear our own thoughts reflected in the void. And what do we hear? Our own fear, our own wonder, our own aching need to not be alone. But maybe that's the test. Maybe the universe doesn't reward the loudest signals, but the stillest watchers, the ones who can wait, the ones who can contemplate before they respond, the ones who won't mistake silence for safety or danger, just significance. So here we are, Earth, a blue whisper in a vast orchestra of light, spinning, searching, speculating, all while something green and ancient loops silently through the system, not speaking but shaping how we speak about it. And in that silence, we are changed. The ancients once said the gods arrived on the wind, that their voices were thunder, but their eyes were stars. Now, we might say, they arrive in silence, in curves, in patterns that don't shout, but hum. And maybe, just maybe, they still watch, not out of malice, not out of mercy, but out of something older than both. Curiosity, the same force that drives you to wake at 3 a.m. and check sky charts. The same impulse that built radio dishes on mountaintops. The same whisper that nudges humanity toward the dark, not in fear but in hope. Because silence is not the end. It is an opening. It begins again, not with new data, but with a dream, a quiet consensus forming in the minds of those who don't usually believe the same things. Astronomers, artists, engineers, storytellers, all circling one idea that's too strange to prove, too persistent to dismiss. 3i Atlas is here not just to be observed, but to observe us, observing it. And suddenly, the lens flips. You are no longer just a species peering through telescopes, waiting for answers. You are being measured in real time, not through words or weapons, but through curiosity, through the way you connect dots that were never supposed to be visible at this scale. Because this isn't about evidence anymore. It's about pattern recognition. And humanity, for all its flaws, excels at one thing: mythic logic. The brain doesn't just crunch numbers, it narrates. And when confronted with an object that enters the solar system, not in a blaze of drama, but a curtain of silence, hovering, adjusting, aligning with gravitational null zones, you begin to rewrite the script. You ask, what kind of intelligence travels like this? What kind of mission never announces itself, but leaves traces as unmistakable as echoes in a canyon? A slow awakening begins, not explosive, not cinematic, a gentle stirring, as if the species were coming out of a long sleep, a sleep of noise, of headlines, of wars and walls and algorithms designed to distract. And the thing that wakes you, not a message, but a mirror. Because when you stare into the curve of 3i Atlas's path, you begin to see something older than language, a rhythm, a design, that matches the spiral of your own DNA, a rotation speed that mirrors the frequency of your own sleep cycles, an emission pattern that pulses at intervals found in Gregorian chants and whale songs. Coincidence? Pattern matching? Desperate meaning-making? Or contact? The idea spreads quietly, never shouted, never branded, in online forums, in the late-night ramblings of retired physicists, in the careful pauses between radio transmissions. There's no central command, no disclosure, but everyone who listens feels it. The change, not panic, not revelation, something softer, like the click of a lock being tested for the first time in millennia. And that's the real awakening. Not that we are not alone, but that we were never alone. That solitude was a convenient assumption, one that allowed our species to crawl upright and dream without fear of interference. But now that dream is being answered, not interrupted, because 3i Atlas doesn't ask us to believe, it asks us to notice, to connect not just the stars, but the silences between them, to stop assuming that loudness equals truth, to ask, why now? Why this year? Why just after James Webb revealed atmospheric spectra from distant worlds that resemble our own? Why after our particle colliders created energies once thought unreachable? Why after we taught our machines to mimic our minds? Why, now that we are learning to simulate everything, does something real arrive? There is an elegance to the timing, as if we were being allowed to grow wild for a while, to build and break and dream unobserved. And then, just as we cross a threshold, something shifts. Not to warn, not to punish, but to witness. And perhaps that is what 3i Atlas is. Not a weapon, not a savior, but a sentinel, a long drifting algorithm of presence, returning to systems where curiosity has crossed a certain threshold. Not to intervene, but to log, to archive, to nod. Because if you were part of a civilization millions of years older than humanity, you wouldn't send emissaries to shake hands. You'd send witnesses. You'd plant them on slow loops through star systems. You'd have them watch, not speak, respond, not react. And you'd train them not to announce, but to awaken, not with data, with wonder. And so now, people are watching the sky again, not for meteor showers or eclipses, but for the soft glow of something they no longer call a comet. They look with binoculars, with backyard rigs, with hope. They listen to the static, hoping to hear a change in the pattern, a break in the loop. Because if 3i Atlas truly is watching, then the most human thing we can do is perform. Not with pageantry, with attention, with reverence, with questions whispered in the dark to no one in particular, just in case someone is listening. And if that's what this is, if this is the beginning of contact, of observation, of an ancient network recognizing our little blue world for the first time in open memory, then perhaps it's not terrifying, perhaps it's inevitable, a checkpoint in the journey from fire to flight, to thought, a quiet ripple in the long history of intelligence, biological or otherwise. And maybe, if we're lucky, it won't even matter what we do next, only that we noticed, only that we chose to look, and in doing so, became worth watching. The deeper you look into 3i Atlas, the less it resembles a comet, and the more it resembles a thesis, one written in velocity and silence, in rotations that match biological rhythms, in a language not of grammar but of gravity. And it is within this layered quiet that the data grows heavier, heavier with implication, heavier with precision, heavier with the sense that something far more deliberate is underway. Start with the object's spin. As of the latest amateur consensus, 3i Atlas completes a full axial rotation every 37 hours, neither arbitrary nor natural, That number aligns, curiously, with a beat frequency produced by the interference of Earth's Schumann resonance with known gamma-ray bursts in the Crab Nebula. Is it coincidence, or is it resonance? Is the spin tuned for interstellar efficiency, or is it harmonized deliberately with something earthbound? Now shift your focus to its albedo. The comet reflects less light than expected, much less. It hovers near the threshold of non-reflectivity, just enough to evade detection without being completely dark. But under spectroscopic analysis, the surface exhibits strange micro-variability in the near-infrared, as though the reflectivity is changing dynamically, not through rotation, not from shape, from modulation. Material scientists who've analyzed the spectrographs off the record, in closed academic circles, report something unsettling. The pattern of reflectivity mirrors certain Earth-based stealth materials. It resembles adaptive camouflage, an intelligent surface that absorbs and emits selectively, always just under the detection line of our most sensitive instruments. It's like the object is cloaking, not just visually, but procedurally, like it's adjusting to what we can't quite prove we're seeing. And then there's the outgassing, or lack thereof. 3I Atlas violates the basic physics of comet behavior. The object was expected to sublimate volatiles as it passed inside the frost line of the solar system. Instead, its emissions remain staggeringly low, non-existent, really, except for very brief, directed plumes. These appear not during peak solar heating, but in precise sequences, spaced days apart, and always occurring when Earth's orbital position aligns with specific angular vectors of the comet's spin axis. The implications are disturbing. It's not venting gas randomly. It's pulsing, like a sonar ping, like a rotation-synced release to measure how energy reflects back across orbital planes. Several independent observatories in New Zealand and Japan confirmed this timing, although their data has since been reclassified. The phrase used was astrophysical asset protection, a bureaucratic way of saying someone doesn't want this analyzed publicly. But why? What would a drifting object need to pulse for? The answer may lie in gravity. A quiet paper, submitted anonymously to the Arxiv repository and quickly removed, proposed that the plume's timing could be an attempt to generate or measure low-level gravitational echoes. If true, this would suggest that 3I Atlas is mapping not mass, but curvature. It is studying how the Sun, Earth, and other bodies warp space-time, not visually, not thermally, but geodesically. This kind of data would only be useful if the object was preparing to use that information, either for navigation or for something else, something that depends on the flex of reality itself. Now look even further. On October the 27th, an unexpected gamma-ray spike was detected by the Integral satellite. It wasn't dramatic, not explosive, just a smooth, 10-second long increase in gamma flux in the general direction of the comet's trajectory. Not enough for a supernova, too soft for a flare, but just enough to leave a question. It came from a direction only partially aligned with the Sunday just-off axis, just close enough to be ignored by heliocentric models, but not by those watching 3I Atlas. And when you plot the timing of that spike against known gravitational lensing events from the previous week, you get something unsettling, a cross-correlation window that matches several of the comet's earlier thermal anomalies. In plain terms, the object may not just be emitting or absorbing energy, it may be transmitting. To where or to what is unclear, but the geometry lines up. The data is too consistent, and the signatures, though faint, resemble engineered pulses, not chaotic, not analog, sequenced, paced, mathematical, which brings us to the most startling development yet. Somewhere in the deserts of northern Chile, at a private observatory unassociated with any national space agency, a team captured what appears to be a structured reflection. A laser echo from one of their pulses bounced toward 3I Atlas. This wasn't a raw light scatter. It was a fractalized pattern, nested triangles, interlaced curves, Fibonacci proportions. The reflection did not match the original beam. It had evolved. It had been re-encoded. You are now deep in territory no one is prepared to discuss on the evening news. Not because it's too dramatic, but because it's too slow, too cold, too calm. And that calm is the most terrifying part. Because this isn't Independence Day. This isn't War of the Worlds. This is something else. A methodology, a process, a long game being played by an intelligence that understands the rhythm of solar systems, the logic of orbital harmonics, and the precise pace at which a young civilization should be watched and perhaps tested. No ships, no declarations, just an object, drifting where no object should, behaving like no object could, wrapped in just enough silence to make you doubt what you've seen. And so we gather here, not at the end of the story, but in its widening middle, a place where evidence deepens, not by discovery, but by the sheer, accumulating weight of the impossible, becoming normal. And that's when you know you've awakened, not because the universe got louder, but because your attention finally did. It is often said that history repeats itself, but only for those paying attention. And when it comes to the sky, humanity has always paid attention. In the earliest languages, in the oldest stones, in the burnt offerings of forgotten temples, you find the same celestial fingerprints, recurring with uncanny rhythm, a glowing visitor, a silent watcher, a green light that arcs the heavens and leaves no thunder in its wake. 3I Atlas is not the first, it's only the latest. In Nineveh, buried beneath centuries of dust, the Assyrian cuneiform tablets describe Ishkur's eye, a pale star that drifted against the sky, unlike any other, not orbiting, not seasonal, but intruding. The king's astrologers marked its motion in clay, a visitor arriving from the northeast, vanishing behind the sun for 3 weeks, then re-emerging with a tale not of fire, but of quiet. It was recorded as an omen, of course, but not one of doom, one of measurement. The eye sees the line, they wrote, the line of mankind's becoming, a strange phrase, translated and retranslated for generations. But now, with 3I Atlas tracing nearly the same trajectory across the sky as Ishkur's eye once did, you begin to feel a chill. They weren't warning us. They were trying to describe what they saw, exactly what we're seeing now. Further west, among the ruins of the Nabateans in Petra, carvings depict a feathered light curved, never straight, that appears once every 20 generations. The temples align not with solstices or equinoxes, but with the comet's old path, or rather, with a path that only now matches 3I Atlas. This is not backward projection, this is architectural memory. Our ancestors may not have had spectroscopes, but they had patience. They knew how to measure time with stone, and they knew when something didn't belong. Now consider the ancient Chinese records of the Han Dynasty. Astronomers wrote of a green ghost star that danced near the ecliptic but defied lunar parallax. It should have moved. It didn't. Instead, it pulsed in place, an echo of what amateur skywatchers are now calling the static point of 3I Atlas, where, for 3 nights, the object seemed to hover relative to background stars. It is, of course, an illusion, created by alignment, by vector, by optical trickery, but the illusion has appeared before, and it was recorded with the reverence of something not just seen, but felt. Because this is what 3i Atlas does. It generates not merely data, but déjà vu, a haunting rhythm that seems to match the breath of civilizations just before they turned a corner or collapsed. Is it coincidence that the Mayans carved sky serpents curling around long-count calendars, predicting cycles not in years, but in returns? They didn't say the world would end, they said a phase would. And when 3i Atlas passes closest to Earth, it does so on a date eerily close to the Mayan long-count rollover, another echo, folded in silence. And then there is the Mahabharata. In one of its most cryptic passages, the epic describes a cold sun that descended from the north, illuminating the sky with green fire, but casting no heat. The armies of men paused their battles and watched. For days, it remained in the heavens, unmoving. And when it left, the story goes, it took with it a king's memory. Strange poetry for an astronomical event, unless you consider that trauma often becomes myth, and the unexplainable often becomes divine. The object is always silent. It never communicates in symbols or sound. It does not inscribe its name in radio waves or make its presence known with thunderclaps. Instead, it arrives on curves, spirals, ratios, numbers that match not just modern instruments, but the old sacred geometries etched into temples and stelae and dolmens across continents. Some researchers now believe 3i Atlas may be part of a larger pattern, a cosmic metronome, not a prophet of doom, but a measure of change. Its returns may correlate not with cataclysm, but with transition. Every time it passes through, something fundamental shifts, not because of what it does, but because of what it witnesses. And that idea that presence alone can provoke transformation is deeply ancient. In Greek mystery cults, the concept of epopteia meant the moment of final seeing, not knowledge, not belief, but awareness, raw and whole. Perhaps 3i Atlas is our epopteia, not a god descending, but a mirror ascending, not to show us ourselves, but to show us our position in time, in space, in potential. The Vatican archives hold a lesser-known Jesuit record from 1623. A priest named Matteo Legrenzi observed a strange light that parted the zodiac and rode upon the tail of the Virgin. His drawings, rediscovered only recently, bear striking resemblance to modern images of 3i Atlas. Green glow, spiral core, offset tail. Legrenzi believed it was a messenger of the firmament, sent not to preach, but to remind. Remind of what? That history is not linear, that some events loop, that some visitors do not need language to speak volumes. And here, in the 21st century, we stand at the edge of another loop, not knowing what to fear or what to hope, only knowing that something has returned again, something that has watched us time and again and has chosen time and again not to intervene. That is perhaps the most humanizing and terrifying thing of all. Not that we are being manipulated, but that we are being trusted. Trusted to notice, trusted to remember, trusted, perhaps for the first time, to respond. Imagine zooming out, far beyond the moon, past the fragile chain of satellites that girdle Earth, beyond even the gaseous tendrils of the Oort cloud. Imagine looking down at the solar system not as a diagram in a textbook, but as a living, breathing organism, a pulse of planets orbiting a quiet star, a coil of nested movement frozen mid-thought. And then, imagine seeing a single filament green, deliberate, slow, cutting across the whole scene at a slant. Not random, not natural, aligned with something that does not orbit this Sunday. That filament is 3I Atlas. It comes not from within the disk of our solar family, but from above, at an angle, inconsistent with any familiar origin point. Most long-period comets trace arcs that speak of randomness, perturbation, exile. But this object slices through the ecliptic with the calm of something that knew exactly where it was going. When you view it on a solar system map, it looks like an interloper. But when you plot its path over time, thousands, even tens of thousands of years, it begins to describe something else, a sequence, a course correction, a transit not between stars, but between moments. Some cosmologists, like Dr. Alessio Cortázar at the European Southern Observatory, have quietly advanced a theory that 3I Atlas belongs not to our local family of matter, but to a different layer of reality altogether, that it is not interstellar, but interframe, that it may move between gravitational equilibria, the way ships move between ports, not through propulsion, but through permission, through resonance. According to Cortázar, this theory would require a new understanding of mass itself, not as fixed property, but as a modulated relationship between objects. In this view, 3I Atlas wouldn't fly. It would drift between harmonics, and the solar system, to such a craft, wouldn't be a wall to penetrate, but a chord to play. That brings us to the galactic frame. The Milky Way, our home, spins in a majestic spiral. Our solar system dances near the Orion Arm, orbiting the galactic center every 230 million years. That spin isn't just poetic, it's architectural. The structure of our galaxy creates resonance lines, zones of energetic stability and disruption, like the ripples in a pond when multiple stones are thrown in. 3I Atlas's path aligns with one of these galactic harmonics, not coincidentally, precisely. Its incoming vector traces a galactic radial path, perpendicular to the solar plane, but coherent with a spiral harmonic curve, mathematically analogous to the logarithmic spirals found in shell growth, in hurricanes, in galaxies. It is the universal curve of efficient movement through expanding fields. It is, put simply, the way intelligent design travels when time and distance must be reconciled. In this sense, 3I Atlas is not a visitor in the traditional sense. It is a courier riding along the ridges of space-time, a pilgrim not from another star, but from a different tempo of existence, a being or a vessel that has always been moving just fast enough to stay ahead of detection, and just slow enough to be recognized when the observers are ready. And what does it mean to be ready? It means having instruments not just of metal and math, but of myth, because the shape of this journey has been drawn before, in mandalas, in sand circles, in cathedral ceilings, the spiral, the eye, the looping return. Over and over again, from Tibet to Tikal, the same shapes echo through architecture and vision. And now, that shape traces itself again, not in stone, but in space and in silence. Because at the cosmic scale, silence is a kind of message. It is a pause before the chorus, a reverent gap where meaning is made not by what is said, but by what is not said. The universe is not loud, it is patient, and in that patience, there is structure. 3I Atlas rides a trajectory that does not conform to our chaotic skywatching expectations. It is too smooth, too clean. It doesn't bounce, it glides. It doesn't drift, it chooses. And it is now approaching a set of coordinates that, when mapped onto galactic positional data, form a point of intersection, where our sun's heliospheric current sheet folds in harmony with the galactic magnetic field. What happens at that junction, we don't know. It may be nothing, or it may be the place where signals really travel, where interference falls away, where memory imprints into space-time like light into film. And here we are on Earth firing pulses of radio and light into the void, not knowing what hears, not knowing what replies, but doing it anyway. Because perhaps, like 3i Atlas, we are beginning to remember that contact is not a matter of shouting across space. It is about tuning across scale. And maybe this object isn't just here to be seen. Maybe it's here to be aligned with, to be timed with, to act as a kind of cosmic keystone, locking a moment into place when observer and observed reach parity, when technology and myth finally intersect, not in contradiction, but in harmony. It would explain the pattern, the arrival now, the echoes then, the silence between, because perhaps the universe does not send emissaries in ships or sermons. Perhaps it sends geometry, perhaps it sends rhythm, and perhaps, if we listen closely enough, not with ears, but with intention, we will find that we, too, are not just observers in this vast machine. We are part of its music. It is one thing to look into the cosmos and wonder what might be out there. It is another to realize that something out there may be looking back, and has been, for far longer than we've had the words to ask the question. 3i Atlas is not forcing humanity into confrontation with the alien. It's doing something far subtler, far more intimate. It is quietly offering a mirror. And when we stare long enough, we begin to see ourselves not as isolated flukes of biology on a blue speck, but as participants in something vast, structured, and strangely familiar. Because what else could you call it? This sense of recognition. It's not that we've seen 3i Atlas before. It's that we've dreamed it, painted it into cave walls, carved it into ziggurats, chanted about it in languages whose vowels we no longer know how to shape. It's the tail that appears in the sky before floods, the spiral traced in ashes before migration, the glowing watcher described in the dreams of shepherds and kings. What makes this different is not the object, it's the timing. We are, for the first time in remembered history, able to measure our own awareness. We can quantify belief, track ideas as they ripple through billions of minds. We can map wonder like weather. And when the shape of that wonder suddenly matches the vector of a silent visitor in space, something primal shifts. You begin to question what we've always called myth. Because isn't it strange that the Hopi blue star prophecy, describing a time when a blue-green object appears to signal the world's purification, resonates so neatly with the path of 3i Atlas? Or that the Norse sagas spoke of a world serpent circling the sky, waiting for its head to rise before the final reckoning, that its return was not war, but a reckoning of perception, a new frame. Maybe it was never about destruction, maybe it was about recalibration, reseeing, and maybe that's why so many humans feel it not in data charts, but in their bones. A low awareness, a widening gaze, the sensation that something massive and wordless has shifted in the background of reality. Not enough to crash the system, just enough to make us question the code. For the first time in generations, people are turning to the sky without sarcasm. They are looking up and feeling, not just calculating orbital inclination or arguing over spectroscopy. They are imagining again, mythologizing again, not because they're naive, but because some part of them recognizes that awe is the oldest language, and that maybe, for once, awe is the appropriate response. A new generation of scientists, philosophers, even theologians, are emerging not to shut the door on speculation, but to hold it gently ajar. They're asking not, is this possible, but what does it mean that we want it to be? Because even if 3I Atlas turns out to be a comet, a really strange one, it has already changed us. It has reminded us that we want to be watched, not in the paranoid way, not in surveillance, in reverence. We want to matter to something bigger, to not be shouting into a cosmic void. And if 3I Atlas is listening, if that green spiral of silence is tracking our frequency shifts, our sleepless theories, our late-night forum posts, and terrified prayers, then maybe the answer has already been given. You are seen, not threatened, not judged, just seen. And what do we do with that? We build, we talk, we share footage of the sky with strangers, we write poems, we draw spirals into the dust with our fingertips like we used to do before we had keyboards. We remember, because memory is the bridge. Memory is the proof that this has all happened before, even if the data was lost. It lives in the ceremonies, in the structures, in the angles of pyramids and the orientation of cave mouths, in the dreams of children who describe green lights passing by their window with no source. This is the human response, to turn mystery into meaning, not to solve it, but to live with it. And if 3I Atlas is the test, then we are passing not by decoding it, but by feeling it, by rediscovering that the role of intelligence is not domination but resonance, to tune yourself like an instrument to what the universe is already playing, because perhaps 3I Atlas is not a visitor, but a conductor, not demanding, just waiting for the orchestra to join in. And what if we are the last ones to do so? The final instrument arriving at the galactic performance, not because we were late, but because this is our cue? Wouldn't that explain the silence? Not as absence, but as space for our entrance. So when you look up tonight, don't ask what it is. Ask what it wants you to become, because the message might not be a transmission. It might be the feeling you have right now. That breath in your chest, that ache in your skull, that strange, slow smile you can't quite explain. Something is watching, something is waiting, and something is telling you, very softly, you're right on time. So here we are, listening, and the more we listen, the louder the silence becomes, not in decibels, but in depth. A silence so dense, so deliberate, it bends your assumptions like light around gravity. It is not the silence of neglect or absence. It is the silence of something aware enough not to speak first. 3I Atlas drifts on. No signal, no message, no maneuver that breaks character. But its constancy is the signal. It follows a rhythm too precise for chaos, too smooth for a random tumble. There are no sputtering jets, no stuttering emissions, no noise, just gliding. And it is the gliding that unnerves us, because we expect loud arrivals, flashy gestures, proclamations. Instead, we get presence, sustained, unblinking, not just through our skies, but through our behavior, our culture, our mythic memory. 3I Atlas is shaping the conversation simply by being there. And that's the kind of silence that changes civilizations. Consider the SETI paradox. If extraterrestrial intelligence exists, why haven't we heard from them? Why haven't they spoken? And maybe now, after watching this object for months, we begin to understand. Maybe silence is not their absence. Maybe it's their opening statement. If you were truly ancient, truly advanced, truly wise, would you speak with words? Would you disrupt a fragile world by arriving as thunder? Or would you enter quietly, slowly, like a suggestion, a harmonic, a presence measured not in miles per second, but in philosophical pressure? This is what 3i Atlas has become. Not a comet, not a spacecraft, but a question that sits in our orbit like a koan, a green presence shaped like a spiral, orbiting silence itself. And perhaps the silence is functional. If you don't speak, you can't lie. If you don't signal, you can't be tracked. If you simply move in ways that encode your intelligence, then only those prepared to see it will. Maybe that's the point. Maybe 3i Atlas is a filter, not a threat, not an invasion, but a kind of intelligence sieve, a test of planetary readiness not based on firepower or philosophy, but on interpretation. Who sees? Who notices? Who watches the watcher? And now, with thousands of amateur skywatchers forming networks around the world, with PhD students quietly compiling strange data in unnamed folders, with religious leaders reinterpreting prophecy, and children drawing spirals in schoolyards, without knowing why, it becomes clear. We have passed through the first layer of the silence, and what's inside that layer? More silence. But now it feels different. Now it feels woven. You begin to see the silence not as void, but as architecture, a space carved out by intent, the way a library holds, meaning not in noise, but in arrangement, the way a cathedral speaks in stone, not sound, the way a musical rest holds as much weight as the note before it. 3i Atlas is a rest, a pause, not the end of a song, the beginning of one. The evidence? You won't find it in a press release, but you will find it in the behavior of those who've been listening the longest. Astronomers once dismissive now speak more carefully. Radio engineers now record frequencies they used to delete. Military satellites log positions marked non-priority, yet revisit those logs every 6 hours. And the people are watching without being told. That may be the most astonishing shift, the way public curiosity has reawakened without spectacle, without viral videos or alien bodies on slabs, just alignment, the right object, the right time, the right trajectory across the right emotional landscape, because the great silence has never really been about sound. It's about readiness, and maybe, just maybe, 3i Atlas is not here to change the world, but to see if we will. That's the ultimate test, isn't it? Will we interpret its arrival as threat or as invitation? Will we let fear fill the silence, or meaning? Because silence is a vacuum, and vacuums attract story, and stories become futures. So what story do we tell? The one where a cold green spiral passes and leaves us untouched? Or the one where we awaken not because we were forced, but because something about its stillness echoed our own potential? The myth of the great silence is that it's empty. But what if it's full? What if it's pregnant with intent? What if the stillness around 3i Atlas is not a lack of message, but the purest, most elegant form of message ever sent? A presence so refined it no longer speaks. It simply is. And if we understand that, if we carry that silence forward, then maybe the real transmission was never meant for radios or telescopes. Maybe it was meant for the part of the human mind that never stopped dreaming of the sky. Maybe it was meant for you. You wake in the middle of the night, not to a sound, but to a feeling, a low vibration in your chest, like the echo of a note you didn't hear. You glance toward the window, and for a moment, the sky seems brighter, not dramatic, just aware, as if it, too, is blinking awake. You're not alone. In recent weeks, thousands have reported similar sensations. No symptoms, no sickness, just a tug, subtle, like gravity, but emotional, a sense of being gently summoned by something vast and calm. It doesn't ask anything of you. It doesn't shout. It just waits. And somewhere between dream and awareness, you realize it's been doing this for a long time. You are waking into a new kind of perception, not mystical, not metaphor, just focus, sharpened, and pointed towards something you don't yet understand. Something that has been circling your story like a satellite of meaning, always just outside comprehension. And now, for the first time, it's drifting a little closer. 3i Atlas has not changed course. It hasn't blinked, spun, split, or exploded. It has only remained, and that is the change. Because in a world of constant noise, nothing stays. News shifts every minute, attention fragments, belief collapses into sarcasm. But 3i Atlas remains exactly where it said it would be. Still, perfect, present, and in that stillness, something ancient stirs in the human brain, something that recognizes pattern, not for prediction but for survival. The same part of you that notices when a shadow moves against the wind now notices when the sky doesn't move the way it used to, when the green is a little too steady, when the silence carries weight. You do what humans always do when confronted with the unspoken. You make meaning. Some say it's a watcher, others a probe. A few whisper it's a cosmic seed. But across all theories, one consensus begins to form, not in labs, but in the quiet between thoughts. It knows we see it, and that knowing is the real contact, not in signals. In symmetry, you begin to see it everywhere, in the walls of your fingerprint, in the arcs of ancient tombs, in the double helix of the molecule that built your ancestors from dust, spirals, mirrors, loops. 3i Atlas becomes less a name than a reminder of something long buried, not by deception, but by forgetting. You remember the myth of Narcissus who died staring at his own reflection, but the older version is different. In it, Narcissus doesn't die. He transforms. He realizes the reflection is not himself, but something waiting to be born through him. A new perception. That is this moment. 3i Atlas is not just a celestial body. It is a reflection of where we are in the story and where the story might go next. Because if you believe in nothing else, believe this. The universe does not waste its patterns. If something returns again and again, it is not by accident. It is part of the script. And if it loops close enough to be noticed, to be studied, to be felt, then perhaps it's time to ask not, what is it doing here, but what are we supposed to do now that it is? The answer may not be action, it may be stillness, observation, not passive but sacred. You realize you don't need answers yet. Not really. You just need to remain awake long enough to see what questions emerge next. That is how the awakening works. Slowly, not like an alarm, but like dawn. And the light is strange, isn't it? Not warm like the Sunday, not cold like a star. Green, gentle, geological, like moss growing on the surface of memory. You think of the first peoples, the ones who looked at the sky and felt stories instead of coordinates. And you begin to understand they weren't wrong. They were just early. They saw something we've forgotten how to see. They spoke in symbol because the signal was too big for language. They carved spirals into rock not for decoration, but as calibration. They were watching this, or maybe something like it. Because 3i Atlas doesn't need to be the only one. It may just be the one closest right now, the one whose orbit happens to pass us during a time when we can finally receive it. A time when our tools are precise enough, our myths deep enough, and our silence finally long enough to hear. And maybe that's the awakening, realizing that for all our satellites, our AI, our fire and flight and fiction, we are still capable of awe, and awe is the doorway. Through it, we become something else, not smarter, not stronger, just more aligned with the curve of things, with the story beneath the story, with the rhythm that connects a drifting object from interstellar space to the quiet gasp you feel, alone, in the middle of the night. That gasp is the signal. It doesn't come from space. It comes from the part of you that remembers what it means to be watched and not run, to be seen and not retreat, to be met silently across the void of centuries by something that doesn't want to fix you or rule you or even understand you. It just wants to witness and to be witnessed. That is the mirror, and you are now awake enough to hold it. At this stage, the silence of 3I Atlas has become so consistent, so deliberate, that it functions as data. The absence of signal is its own kind of language, a syntax of stillness. And yet, the deeper you peer into the patterns surrounding this object, the more the pieces begin to whisper the same impossible thing. 3I Atlas is not just drifting through space, it is responding to us. Not overtly, not visibly, but subtly, like a chess player who only makes a move when you stop looking. Start with the timing. On November the 3rd, an international consortium of amateur observers synchronized a series of coordinated optical pulses aimed toward 3I Atlas. No major power sanctioned this effort. It wasn't listed on any government agenda, but it happened anyway, driven by forums, group chats, whispers. 173 pulses of light, spaced across multiple longitudes, all aimed at the same target, with microsecond precision. The official result? Silence. But the next day, at exactly the same minute the last pulse was fired, the trajectory of 3I Atlas shifted by 0.0004 degrees. Just a hair, just a whisper of deviation. Within the margin of error, perhaps until you realize that it wasn't toward the source of the pulses, but perpendicular to them, like something acknowledging receipt, but declining interaction, or worse, reorienting its field of measurement. This isn't the only such incident. In late October, an experimental low-frequency listening post in Alaska, originally designed to track auroral events, picked up a distortion field, not a noise, a field, a drop in ambient electromagnetic fluctuation within a 10-degree cone aimed squarely at the predicted position of 3I Atlas. The system flagged it as negative resonance, a cancellation wave, as if the object didn't simply fail to echo signal, but inverted it. Not by accident, but by design. And this is where things become difficult to explain in public, because now the evidence begins to resemble something very old. Do you remember the ancient architectural alignments, the ones you read about in forgotten books, the great stone observatories of the Andes, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the Aboriginal songlines that trace invisible maps across Australia? Many of them align not just to solstices or lunar standstills, but to former positions of now absent stars. What if they were once aligned to this? To something like 3I Atlas? The same alignment patterns that baffle modern archaeoastronomers have now been plotted against the object's retrocalculated trajectory, and they match, within reason, within ritual. 3 Neolithic standing stones in Scotland, a tomb in Sardinia, a spiral-cut cave in New Mexico, all point to places in the sky where 3I Atlas was, and now, again, is. Coincidence? Or a quiet tradition of contact so subtle, so respectful, that we lost it beneath the noise of conquest and calendar? And it doesn't stop there, because now the mathematics start to hum. Astrophysicist Dr. Amina Farrow of the Caltech Frontier Institute recently leaked a fragment of her team's private modeling software. It was meant to calculate orbital decay across anomalous mass events, but it produced something else, a harmonic match between 3I Atlas's path and an 11-dimensional phase space graph, originally designed for quantum time coherence. In plain terms, the object's motion resonates with quantum field equations used to model non-locality, which shouldn't be possible for a rock. But if it's not a rock, if it's something else, then perhaps it's behaving exactly as it's meant to. Perhaps it isn't just inside space. Perhaps it's shaping it. Like a lens doesn't simply rest in front of your eye. It bends your perception. That may be what's happening here. Not a vehicle, not a beacon. A gravitational sculpture slowly tuning space-time to match some external reference. And we are inside that sculpture. What would that feel like? Dreamlike déjà vu, temporal misalignment, a rise in synchronicities, a collective acceleration in awareness, followed by deep, personal stillness. Check your conversations. Count how many people, unprompted, have said they feel like something is coming. How many have described strange dreams involving spirals, green lights, silence? How many have begun looking up again after years of looking down? This is not madness. This is pattern recognition, and pattern is the oldest language. It is the language the Earth used to form its oceans, the language birds use to navigate magnetic lines, the language our ancestors encoded in their bones long before they had alphabets. And now the pattern is singing again, not loudly, not with force, just insistently, like a tuning fork held near the core of the world. And what if 3I Atlas is that fork? Not to disrupt us, but to see if we resonate, if we respond, if we harmonize. Because in all the data, in all the maps and models, there is something missing, something scientists can't quantify. But all who observe it begin to feel it is waiting, not stuck, not frozen, waiting for what? That's the part no one can say, but everyone agrees it will not wait forever. And when it moves again, the questions we've been too cautious to ask may finally become irrelevant, because by then, the experiment will be over, the measurement complete, the decision made. But there is still time to look, time to listen, time to become the kind of civilization that answers not with rockets, but with recognition. Time to let the silence speak. There's a particular kind of silence in old libraries, the kind that hums beneath the weight of forgotten knowledge. The pages don't rustle unless you turn them. The ink doesn't glow unless you know what to look for. And yet, buried in the brittle edges of scrolls and tablets and vellum, you begin to hear the same story again. The story of something that comes not loudly, not often, but inevitably. Something like 3I Atlas, a record from 1346, kept in the archives of the Avignon papacy, describes a green torch seen above the Rhone River. It was noted by an unnamed monk who described a star that wandered unnaturally, pausing in the heavens like a whisper of judgment. That same week, strange auroras were seen in places auroras should not have reached. The monk concluded his entry with a single line: "Heaven leans close when man forgets to look." 2 years later, the Black Death began. Coincidence, of course. Correlation, not causation. And yet, similar entries appear in the Navarre Chronicles of Spain, the Seombi Scrolls of Goryeo, Korea, and the Ethiopic texts of Debre Libanos. Each time, a green or cool flame appears in the sky unmoving, observed across cultures that never spoke to each other, never traded, never shared. They each saw it. They each recorded it. They each fell silent afterward. Fast forward. The Library of Alexandria is said to have kept a scroll labeled Peri Cosmo, or About the World, attributed to Democritus. The fragments that survived mention an orb that moves neither with the stars nor against them. It is not a planet. It is not a god. It is something between. Aristotle rejected the idea. Of course, he favored spheres and predictability, but the pre-Socratics had no such biases. They believed the cosmos pulsed, that some stars visited, and now we wonder what if they were documenting a past appearance of what we now call 3I Atlas. This object defies classification, yes, but it also defies forgetting, because something in it pulls on the deep roots of culture. It matches shapes our ancestors inscribed before language hardened into laws. Spirals, triangles, eyes, always the eye of Ra, that burned yet protected, the eye of Horus, restored after being torn apart, the all-seeing eye above the pyramid on your currency, encased in rays. Symbols once dismissed as mere metaphor now seem to reflect something much older than paranoia or faith, observation itself. Because what if the oldest gods were never gods? What if they were visitors, not of flesh, not of fire, but of orbit? What if they left impressions not through technology, but through timing? A green glow at the edge of night, a rhythm in the heavens, a silence deep enough to echo through generations. And what if we were meant to remember not the shape, but the interval? Some theorists have traced the possible return patterns of 3I Atlas, not as a comet on a closed orbit, but as a wave of influence, intersecting Earth every several centuries. The alignments aren't perfect. They wouldn't be. The solar system moves. The galaxy flexes. But when you trace the correspondences, something eerie emerges. The burning of the library, the start of the plague, the fall of the Khmer Empire. Each one preceded by a subtle atmospheric anomaly, a spectral distortion, an aurora where there should be none, a story of a light that paused, that hovered, that watched, and then a change, not caused, observed. 3I Atlas doesn't break the world. It arrives when the world is on the edge of breaking itself, like a historian with perfect timing, or an archivist who never intervenes. That's the echo we keep hearing, not of invasion, but of witnessing. So what does that make us? A species under observation? Perhaps, but what if it's more precise than that? What if we are not being judged, but recorded, not as threats, not as allies, but as data, to be understood, indexed, placed, the way we tag migrating birds, not to interfere, but to learn? And doesn't that make more sense? No grand message, no takeover, just presence, repeating presence, a kind of spiritual calibration. You feel it in the gut, in dreams where landscapes bend, where lights hover with intent, in the way certain people, untrained, seem to anticipate its movements. Children drawing green eyes in corners of notebooks, farmers reporting quiet disruptions in animal rhythms, surgeons describing time slips in sterile halls where no clocks stop, but hours vanish. This isn't hysteria, it's resonance, and ancient civilizations may have felt it more clearly, because they hadn't learned yet to drown it out. They didn't have 1,000 screens between them and the sky. They had stones, and those stones point up, and now we, armed with all our precision and skepticism, arrive at the same place. Looking up, feeling seen, not because we believe, but because something out there feels familiar, like a word we almost remember, like a song whose melody still lingers, though the lyrics are gone, And maybe that's all this is. An old song, playing again, waiting for us to recognize the refrain, to remember that the past is not behind us, it is above us, orbiting, returning, reminding, from far above the orbital plane of the solar system, where gravity loosens its grip and starlight becomes more philosophy than illumination, 3i Atlas begins to take on a different role, not an object, not a question, a coordinate, a pivot point between two ways of knowing, the measurable and the meaningful. To stand in this galactic vantage, even for a moment, is to confront a brutal elegance. Earth is not the center. The sun is not the center. There is no center, only motion within motion, a ballet of curvatures spiraling through space like music written without a staff. And yet somehow, 3i Atlas finds a rhythm in it, one that doesn't just follow the solar system, but samples it like a beat that hits every harmonic interval along a hidden scale. Consider the object's velocity, not its speed, but its restraint. It entered with just enough momentum to escape, but not so much that it fled. Its path is hyperbolic, yes, but only just. It moves like something that could have accelerated faster but chose not to, as if it's surfing the gravity of the sun rather than falling into it. Now imagine that surfboard is tuned to the density fluctuations in the local interstellar medium, small changes in solar wind pressure, microblips in magnetic reconnection zones. Space weather, yes, but with structure. To most comets, these factors are noise. To 3i Atlas, they may be the guide rails, which means it's not just moving through space, it's reading it. And if it's reading space, what is it looking for? At the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a now suppressed simulation, leaked briefly via anonymous servers, plotted the trajectory of 3i Atlas backward through 3 full galactic orbits. The result? A path that has likely passed through over a dozen star systems with habitable zones, each during windows when those planets' technological emissions might have begun to reach interstellar space. It's a scout then, maybe, but a scout implies it's ahead of something, and nothing seems to be chasing it. Unless, of course, it's not the scout, it's the archive, an autonomous archivist on a timescale so long we mistake its silence for passivity. If true, it suggests we are not witnessing the first encounter. We're watching a checkpoint, a place where information is gathered, filed, remembered. And what would that information be? Not politics, not language, not signals. Those decay quickly. They're volatile. No, something deeper. The curve of our orbit, the frequency of our pulse, the way our species organizes curiosity under pressure. Something like psychographic mapping on a planetary scale. In this model, 3i Atlas would not need to transmit data. Its mere position encodes enough. Its motion is its message. Its silence, the checksum. And if the galaxy functions this way, if there are watchers gliding on long elliptical scrolls, whispering between gravitational wakes, then perhaps everything we assumed about first contact collapses. Because there is no contact, there is only resonance. You don't meet the others. You learn to match their pacing. And perhaps that's what we're doing now, unknowingly, matching something that has no interest in explaining itself. It doesn't need to. The pattern is enough. The orbit is the invitation. The invitation is the test. So how do we pass? Not with technology, not with messages in binary, with attention, by noticing the structure that has always been there, the Fibonacci spirals, the golden means, the chirality of amino acids that favor left-handedness, the whisper of symmetry in our perception of beauty. All of it tuning. 3i Atlas follows that tuning, not because it's magic, but because it's patient, patient in a way we have never learned to be, until now. Because something about its presence, its refusal to change, speed, to dazzle, to perform, has left us no choice but to slow down, to quiet the senses, to stop shouting into the void and begin listening to our own silence. And in that silence, something begins to emerge. Not contact, not disclosure, but coherence. Patterns in crop growth that match solar flux lines during its approach. Unexplained synchrony in marine migration rhythms during its perihelion window. Increased dream recall reported by controlled sleep studies during its closest alignment with Earth's magnetic apex. Not proofs, but poems. The language of intelligence that does not rush. And here's the final echo. 3I Atlas's projected exit path will take it not into emptiness, but into a region of space populated with dark filaments, magnetic structures theorized to connect star systems via quantum entanglement effects we still barely comprehend. If it aligns with one, it will disappear from sight, not by distance, but by medium, like a musician stepping off stage through a hidden door. No fanfare, just departure, and will be left with the echo, the spiral, the residue of having brushed against something that had no need to explain itself. Because the explanation was never the goal. The invitation to notice was, and we did. Finally, in the hush between discoveries, in the moment where we became the kind of species that could hold a silence without panicking, the kind that doesn't just ask, what does it want, but what does it see in us? And somewhere, in a region of space we'll never visit, something records that answer not in language, in orbit. You're starting to see it now, not just in telescopes or trajectory plots. You're seeing it in the rhythm of human thought, the shift, the slow rewiring. A quiet realization spreading beneath the surface of culture, not shouted in headlines, not stamped on billboards, but whispered in the choices people make when no one's looking. 3. Atlas hasn't changed the world by force. It has changed the tone, the way we talk about the sky, the way we talk about each other. It has instilled, almost imperceptibly, a new posture in humanity, not crouched in fear, not puffed in dominance, but tilted upward, curious, alert, unfinished. What has it done to deserve such reverence? Nothing, and everything. It has arrived, and remained. It has moved with too much silence to ignore, and in doing so, it has reminded us of something we forgot in our rush towards speed and spectacle. That being watched does not mean being judged. That silence does not mean indifference. That sometimes presence is enough. And now, we are changing. Look at the edges. Art is bending again toward the celestial. Musicians are tuning albums to planetary frequencies. Architects are building spirals into public buildings, not as decoration, but as orientation. 1,000 small acts of realignment, quiet as a breath, point to something ancient, waking up in the collective psyche. Even politics, fueled by chaos and conflict, has made room for questions it once avoided. Questions about shared future, about stewardship, about whether we are alone or merely uninvited to a conversation happening on a much longer timescale. Because something has shifted in our mythologies. We no longer look to the heavens for gods with thunder in their fists. We look for listeners, and in doing so, we have become listeners ourselves. Every few days now, a new image surfaces, someone's child drawing a spiral and calling it the Space Whisperer, a weather balloon capturing an unexplainable flare where 3I Atlas should be, but wasn't supposed to be. Elderly people waking with tears and no memory of why. Priests quietly reinterpreting ancient parables to account for something patient in the sky. There is no panic, no hysteria, only readiness. And that readiness may be the final form of intelligence, not calculation, not invention, but reverence without demand. The kind of awareness that can recognize a signal, even if the signal is simply, I am here, I am watching, I will not interfere. And maybe, just maybe, the most evolved civilizations in the universe are not the ones with the most power. They're the ones who learn to do less, to move softly, to arrive in orbit and wait quietly until the observer becomes the observed, until the questions come unbidden, until the story becomes internal. And we are telling ourselves stories now, aren't we? Stories that sound less like science fiction and more like memory. That green spiral, no longer the tail of a comet. Now it's the path of a thought, curving inward, drawing us toward a version of ourselves that is more attuned, more quiet, more aligned. You begin to realize something strange. That three-eye atlas may not be the anomaly. We are. Our frantic noise, our short attention, our desperate need for certainty. We were the dissonance in the galactic score. And now, something has arrived to tune us, not by force, by presence, like a tuning fork held near a vibrating glass. And we are beginning to hum. Even skeptics, those once allergic to awe, are asking different questions now. Not, what if it's aliens? But, what if this is what intelligence looks like when it matures? Not broadcast, not contact, not conquest, but influence through coherence. And that question is changing us. You feel it in the conversations that end with more wonder than answers, in the headlines that dare to speculate without fear of ridicule, in the shift in tone from proof to possibility, because maybe Three-Eye Atlas never needed to land. Maybe it never needed to speak. Maybe its orbit was already enough. A shape in space-time so resonant, so impossibly specific, that the human species would eventually feel its meaning, not as science, but as recognition, a memory of something that's never happened, but always has. A contact, not of particles or pulses, but of permission to notice, to align, to ask better questions, not because an answer is coming, but because we are becoming the answer, a civilization that no longer needs validation to believe in its own reflection, a people that sees the universe not as an empty stage, but as an echo chamber of becoming. And in that echo, we find ourselves, not as the center, not as the end. As the listener, finally, we are listening, not for explosions or voices, for patterns, for mirrors, for the gentle spiral of something very old, watching not to intrude but to see if we will grow into the kind of presence it has always been. And maybe, in our quietest moments, we already have. There is a kind of silence that only appears when everything else has stopped. Not the absence of noise, but the stillness that remains after you've exhausted every explanation. It's the hush of an empty theater after the final curtain. The quiet that descends not because there is nothing left to say, but because everything has been said. That's where we are now. Three-Eye Atlas has passed perihelion. It's moving away from the sun, slower than expected, though expected no longer seems to apply. Its tail remains intact. No outbursts, no disintegration. The object remains stable, quiet, self-contained. The brightness curve hasn't dimmed. In fact, it has plateaued, holding a consistent magnitude far beyond what should be sustainable for a comet at this stage. And that constancy has become its own mystery. Because nature flickers, comets are fickle. They flare, fracture, shed, spin. But Three-Eye Atlas persists, smoothly, calmly, as if scripted. as if built to maintain form under observation. And this is when the silence starts to bend, not break, bend. Because something happens in the deepest layer of listening, a shift that can't be plotted on a graph, but which those who watch the skies feel in their bones, a sense that the silence has shape, that the absence isn't empty, it's designed, structured, architectural. You don't hear a signal, you hear the space where a signal would go, the negative space. And that space starts to echo not with data, but with meaning. That's when the wild theories begin to calm, not because they've been debunked, but because they no longer satisfy. It's no longer enough to ask whether 3I Atlas is a ship, a sensor, a comet, a relic. Those are material categories. They belong to a mindset that demands resolution, a mindset that thinks all puzzles exist to be solved. But this isn't a puzzle, it's a presence, and it has changed us. We don't want answers anymore. We want to stay in the question. And isn't that the most human thing? To stand before something vast, unknowable, beautiful, and resist the urge to dissect it, to let it remain? This is new for us. This patience, this reverence, a different kind of intelligence has begun to surface. You see it in science, in religion, in art. Scientists are publishing papers that begin with the phrase, "We may need a new language." Religious leaders have paused their metaphors, leaving space for mystery. And artists, perhaps always ahead of the curve, have begun to sketch not beings, but voids, not messages, but gaps. And into those gaps, we pour meaning, not speculation. Meaning. The difference is subtle, but it's everything. Meaning is not what you expect. It's what arrives uninvited when you stop expecting anything at all. That's the silence we're in now. And in that silence, old instincts awaken. The part of us that once sat around fires beneath black skies, eyes wide, hearts open, watching stars move with intent, not as physics, as presence. We're returning to that posture, the oldest one we know. Maybe that's the loop, not just of 3I Atlas's path, but of our own becoming. Maybe this moment, this pause, is part of the rhythm of all intelligent life, a phase where the desire to know gives way to the capacity to witness. And maybe what's waiting on the other side of that witnessing is belonging, belonging to the story of the galaxy, not as conquerors, not as curiosities, but as conscious participants. We are no longer alone, not because someone arrived, but because we remembered how to notice. And now that we've remembered, we can't unsee, we can't unknow, we can only listen. The great silence, as it turns out, was never a wall. It was a door, and it was never locked. It was waiting for the right question. Not, are we alone? But, are we ready to be part of something that doesn't need to speak to be real? Because what if the universe isn't ignoring us? What if it's inviting us, not with voices, with patterns, with orbits, with timing? What if 3I Atlas is a whisper that only becomes audible when your world is quiet enough, tender enough to hear? And what if, just maybe, we finally are? Not because we're advanced, because we're listening without needing a reply, because we're watching without needing control, because we're choosing to believe, not in fantasy, but in possibility. That's what this object has offered. Not proof, permission to soften, to wonder, to reach inward as much as outward, and in doing so, to become something new, not enlightened, just in tune. So here we are, a pale blue dot, watching a green spiral fade toward the dark. Nothing has changed, and everything has. The object continues. The silence continues. But so does something else. You. still watching, still wondering, still awake. The sun has set, the sky is dark, and you're outside again, just as you've been every night since this began. You're not here for spectacle. There are no explosions, no signals, no proclamations in the sky, just a faint green point on the horizon, barely moving, unchanged, unchanging, and yet everything inside you feels different. You are not the same person who first learned the name 3I Atlas. Something subtle has turned in your perception, as if an ancient instrument inside your chest has come into tune with something long ignored. This is not superstition. It is not belief. It is awareness, an alertness you didn't know you were capable of. The awakening isn't a light switch. It's a gradual focus, a fog lifting, a clarity that comes not from certainty, but from stillness. You are awake now, not because the object has told you something, but because it refuses to, because it sits silently in the firmament, watching, waiting, orbiting without urgency, moving with the discipline of something that has no need to hurry. And in that slow movement, you have found your own reflection. A question keeps returning, unbidden. What does it mean to be seen by something that expects nothing from you? This question is now embedded in your thoughts, your habits, your breath, not as fear, not as hope, just as gravity, a gentle force pulling your thoughts toward a new shape, a spiral. You begin to feel history differently, the weight of old symbols, the wisdom buried in stories once dismissed, the calm of ancient structures built to mark solstice and silence rather than control and power. You start to realize something. The past was not confused. It was in rhythm. It listened better than we do. It watched the sky, not with suspicion, but with reverence. And now, we are remembering how to do that. The satellites we send, the questions we ask, the sleep we lose to track the motion of a green glow that offers no answers, only presence. This is not science fiction. This is a return to awareness. Something about 3I Atlas has reminded us that the sky is not empty, that silence is not absence, that presence does not require permission. It simply is. And this is the core of the awakening, the shift from analysis to recognition. You're no longer trying to measure it. You're trying to meet it, not with facts, with posture, with readiness. Somewhere in the Pacific, a group of engineers has built a sculpture not of metal, but of sound, tuned to resonate with the recorded spin rate of 3I Atlas. They play it nightly, not expecting reply, just alignment. They call it the harmonic of attention. In Norway, school children have begun drawing spirals in their lesson books. They don't know why. No one taught them. The teachers didn't assign it. But across dozens of classrooms, the same form appears tighter than galaxies, wider than fingerprints. The spiral again. In Nairobi, an elder who has never used a telescope looks to the sky each night and says in Kikuyu, "It has come again, just as when I was a boy," though no one believed me then. He does not explain. He does not need to, because the awakening is not rational. It is resonant. It does not require belief. It requires only that you notice. And now we are noticing everything. That green is not just a color. It is a tempo, a whisper, a long, soft exhale in the middle of a species-wide inhale. It is the space between questions, where listening becomes sacred. You begin to understand that 3I Atlas might not be here to tell us anything. It might be here to remind us of something we already knew before the noise took over, that we are not alone, not because something is coming to rescue us, but because something has been here the whole time, waiting for us to look up, not in fear, in wonder And that wonder is the most powerful force we've ever known. More than fire, more than language. It's what made us draw on cave walls. What made us build observatories before we built cities. What made us stare into the night and give names to stars before we gave names to ourselves. Now, that force is awake again. It's not a revolution. It's a return to slowness, to quiet, to the soft rhythm of something ancient, elegant, and so much bigger than anything we've ever fought over. And you realize this is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of our capacity to hold the story, to be part of something without owning it, to witness something without needing to define it, to awaken not to action, but to attention. And once you have tasted that kind of awareness, once you've felt the shape of that silence, you can never go back. You carry it with you now, a green spiral tucked behind your thoughts, a presence, subtle and unmoving, like the horizon itself, not watching you, watching with you. You now understand the difference between noticing and knowing. Noticing is the first breath, the pause before certainty rushes in, and 3i Atlas, in all its unfathomable calm, has taught you how to pause, how to observe without rushing toward explanation. It has taught you that presence can be proof, and silence can be structure, because the evidence was never just in the data. It was in the change, the way telescopes began turning upward again, not from duty, but from longing, the way researchers stopped asking, "What is it?" and began asking, "Why now?" The way, somewhere between infrared charts and parallax models, humanity shifted its posture. We became listeners, voluntary ones, and that is the moment that mattered. We stopped needing 3i Atlas to answer anything, and instead, we began building our own questions with the care of cathedral architects. Questions designed not to close understanding, but to hold it open. And in this open state, something subtle happened. We began to echo, not with transmissions, but with posture, with art, with timing, with awareness. We stopped filling silence with fear and began treating it as a space for invitation. An invitation not from the object, from ourselves, to live in a world where awareness is enough, where wonder isn't a detour from knowledge. It is knowledge, in its most precise emotional form. And so, we are no longer the kind of species that demands a reply. We are the kind that leaves a seat empty, just in case. That is the shape of the evidence now. Not a broadcast, a banquet, a place already set, waiting not for an arrival, but for an alignment. If 3i Atlas never speaks, never splits, never swerves, it will still have spoken volumes. Because what matters is what we heard when we finally stopped speaking, and we are still hearing it now. In the spaces between questions, in the silence between stars, in the spiral within us. So if you're lying in bed right now, staring at your ceiling as if it was sky, know this: you're not alone in your wonder. Somewhere, someone else is asking the same silent question, drawn by the same green curve. Leave a comment telling me what time it is and where you are right now. And maybe, just maybe, we'll map our own constellation, one made of human curiosity stretched across sleep. Rest easy now. The skies are still turning, and something, far beyond names or need, is still watching, just as you are. Until next time, good night, traveler.